If you start from the premise that creative is 70% of results, then there's just a whole bunch of things that are downstream of that that like are like completely absurd. Like, like it's absurd that there's no factor for creative quality in an MMM if you agree that creative is 70%
No,
of results. Like
absolutely.
there's just no way it's accurate if that's the case. I
Yeah.
mean, like it's absurd that bids don't factor in expected creative performance in any way. But they factor in like the weather and the time of day and all these other like tiny like media side. So like there's just all these absurdities that I think are kind of like just downstream of the fact that like this wasn't possible in the past.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah.
And so like it just takes a little bit for like kind of history to kind of things to work itself out. But in that meantime, like now, there's huge opportunity because like the 70% is like completely unoptimized.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing Podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. I also run an agency, Did It. I have a brand, Truth Nutrition, a nonprofit, and a bunch of other things that I do. So the common theme is marketing. That's why I'm super excited to have Alex Collmer, the founder of Vidmob, on as my guest. So let's start, Alex, with the origin story of Vidmob and how dramatically different that is than the ecosystem we live in today.
Well, I think pretty much anything that's touched technology is very different than it was 11 years ago. But certainly that's true for Vidmob. So when we started Vidmob, the thinking was fairly in some ways similar, right? Like the idea was that creative is really important. And that if you can improve your creative effectiveness, that's going to improve the effectiveness of your campaigns. But how we applied that was quite different. So at the time, it was fairly easy to see that the internet was in the process of transitioning from primarily text and images to video. We kind of knew that video was harder to create for than images and text, and that was going to lead to a lot of creative friction. So what we did at launch was we built a marketplace, essentially matching brands with editors who we were able to train on how to make kind of highly performant content for Snapchat and Instagram and the Google and et cetera. And that business actually scaled pretty quickly because, not surprisingly, people, they had sort of TV assets or raw media, but they didn't really know how to get them to be, highly performant, vertical ads in those places. And as the business grew, we built sort of workflow software to be able to sort of manage this, pretty complex process of making, 500 assets for, L'Oreal or something. And where that workflow ended was in connecting into the ad account so we could distribute the finished content there so you didn't have to like download them all and then sort of we transfer them over, and that was a big pain. And just sort of sometimes you have these kind of happy accidents in a sense where when we connected into the ad accounts, we started getting performance data back, and so we could see how every asset performed. And that was where things started to get really interesting. Where we're kind of like, okay, if here's an industry that basically creators don't really get performance information. So they don't know, like, hey, I made this decision last week and I made, put the logo here and I did this and that. You don't really ever know, was that a good decision or a bad decision? And then similarly, like on the media side of the house, where everyone's sort of spending, the dollars that actually drive the business, they kind of like had no control over the thing that was the most important factor in their success. And so that started us on this journey to what is now kind of modern Vidmob, which is, in a sense, a very different business.
So obviously, the advent of big data, deep data, the ability to really dissect, creative in the same way that you could dissect media segmentation, seems to have opened up a huge opportunity. But you have sort of an interesting headwind, tailwind situation going on because as brands are embracing creator created assets, influencer style creators that come with their own audience and the ability to tell a story in their own way, right? You've got that happening. And those folks, while they maybe now have a feedback loop as a result of your platform or other ways they can get feedback, they're operating mostly on gut, right? And but when you take all this information, you start to feed it into not just the CDP or a robust data set and analyze it. You now have the ability to sort of AI to create some creative, which is almost on a real-time feedback loop, whereas creators are sort of like, oh yeah, I told that story and it worked really great for the brand, and I inserted my promo code there and sold a lot of product, right? So are those adversarial with each other? Can they coexist? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're sort of putting your finger on, one of the biggest challenges that marketers have right now, where and we hear this all the time, is just this sense of like losing control, where, just you go back even a handful of years, you would have had a fairly small number of assets and they'd be tested intensely with, Kantar or like, other sort of like panel-based systems, and you'd know exactly what's going to happen when you launch them and, feel like you're kind of the risks are limited. Well, now all of a sudden you have content sort of 1,000xing, 10,000xing across two primary vectors. Like the first is sort of Gen AI and just sort of more accelerated production systems. And the second, as you mentioned, is sort of this like influencer and creator content, both of which are amazing and have incredible potential, but they're also terrifying, right? Because I think that the comment that we hear all the time is like trust is earned in drops and lost in gallons. And here you have 1,000x more content being made by effectively computers that don't care about your brand, and 14-year-olds that don't care about your brand. And so that's a really tricky place when your job is to protect a 100-year-old asset that is like the most valuable thing in the business. Uh, and so I think a big part of what we're trying to do is build the technology to enable that scaled, you know, governance, management, and most importantly, learning, so that brands can get back to a sense of having a sense of control over this. And then when you do that, then things get actually really powerful where if you can actually orchestrate 1,000 pieces of content in a way that it actually tells like a unified, cohesive story across many people in many formats, that's really powerful. But that's not something that you get through just like winging it, with 1,000 people guessing at once.
Yeah, it's interesting. You that opens up the Pandora's box of, brand value comes through differentiation, right?
Mhm.
And sure, you hired a great agency and they had a great creative director and they came up with a unique, brand value proposition and great creative, and then they maybe hired actors in the old days, and now they're maybe collaborating with creators all the way from the micro creators up to the Kardashians, right? And sort of but do you lose that, right? If everybody's using influencers and everyone's using, you know, uh, generative created creative, right? Is a prompt engineer who's a creative director going to be able to infuse into the creative the brand value properly, the same way they gave a creative brief to the influencer and said, do it in your voice, tell your own story, but here's what I need to get across that's on brand.
Yeah, I mean that is, I think, the both the challenge and the opportunity, right? And I think like it's so easy to think that AI is going to like limit our ability to be creative and lead to this kind of like sea of sameness or slop filled universe or whatever. And like I understand all that, um, but it's just not necessarily what I see, right? Like what we see is incredibly capable artists doing like wild things with these sort of generative tools to make really incredible things, right? And so like I think the universe we're heading into, we'll have more data and we'll have more like consistent learning, but hopefully not at the expense of enabling creativity, right? Like, and like the way I sort of think about it is there's really nothing that we are doing that's going to replace that upfront role of like the big brand, the Snickers, you're not you and you're hungry, or Coke and a smile, or like that. The need for the sort of agency created like big platform exists more than ever, right? Like we need unified, formats and themes and platforms that we can build on. But then within the sort of very tactical execution of that, there are subtle changes that can be made that might lead to two, three, 400% differences in performance
Right.
because of the way we tend to like process imagery and story narrative in some of these like really rapid like feed environments. So it's like it's not A or B, it's kind of an A plus B kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess then a follow-up question to that is, when there wasn't the ability to have this diverse, infinite creative ecosystem, right? The creative directors had to create sort of a set of creative that would work against the broadest definition of their target audience, right?
Mhm.
So regardless of how broadly or tightly it was defined, that one set of messaging, that one creative needed to sort of work for
Yep.
everybody, right? And so now with the idea of, okay, well, I understand there's like actually 16 pretty big segments that still probably deserve their own creative. And there's going to be variances there, right? And then, of course, platform specific variances, right? Because your first 5 seconds of video on TikTok versus your first five YouTube seconds and Insta seconds, Reel seconds, whatever, they're probably going to need to be different, right? So you end up with this inherent complexity as a result of lots of segments and platforms at the same time. I mean, it's mind blowing if you start to think about the old way of managing creative.
Yeah. No, I mean, and this is one of these things that, like so many things now, like it really does require a technology platform, right? Like, and I like what I liked in there was you said, 16 segments, not infinity, right? Like I,
Yeah.
I think there's this like common, I think misconception that we're gonna get to like, or that we should get to like 100% personalized.
Yeah, one to one. Yeah.
And to me, that just like I often think that like total personalization, like personalization is just another word for loneliness. Like I kind of imagine like the different experiences between, sitting in a theater with, 500 people watching, a funny movie versus sitting there by yourself. The second one's pretty grim. Um, and so like I think there are like unfortunately like we're not as unique and interesting as maybe some people like to think. And so there's some relatively finite number of segments um, that is the right level of personalization. And then within there, absolutely, like by desired outcome, whether it's brand or sales or other metric, or format or platform, those are going to need to be overlays on that and that get to those sort of like tactical changes to the execution. And important to note, the changes you need to make for each of those things are going to always evolve, right?
Right.
Like culture is going to continue to move, and so what you might have done for segment A on this platform and format, 6 months ago, probably isn't going to be what you would recommend today. And so we need to have systems that are able to kind of monitor these with effectively real-time performance, understand when there's been sort of like tectonic shifts in the way we think about things, and kind of update those recommendation systems. And that effectively is what we think of as creative data. Like if sort of like the last 15 years of ad tech have been almost essentially almost 100% built on identity data,
Right.
and all of the things that come downstream from that, the targeting and segmentation and personally like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, addressability. There's an idea now that like we're starting to kind of reach the end of that S curve. That like we've just naturally, when you have 1,000 companies working on something for 15 years, you get to a point where like the incremental gains are just not that big.
Yeah.
And so like Google's in market now saying like creative is the last frontier or next frontier. Meta's in market saying creative is the new targeting. There's this idea that like basically like we're kind of entering chapter two.
Hmm.
And we think that it's chapter one was identity data, chapter two is creative data. It is the ability now to start to focus on creative effectiveness. And what's interesting is marketers have long agreed that creative is like 50 to 70% of results.
For sure.
It's like the second chapter is actually, if the first was about the 30% piece, now we're focused on the piece that's two and a half times bigger.
Yeah.
which is, I think, pretty exciting.
So, let's think about, I think we had spoken earlier about a term like creative intelligence systems, right? That can really deconstruct what's working, what's not working. Does that create like the data haves and the data have nots as it relates to that? I mean, I sort of think about, pick any category, whether it's apparel or beverage or cosmetics, right? The L'Oreals of the world are going to end up with a really robust creative intelligence system to tease out the nuance by segment and by platform, right? And then, but how does the startup or smaller brand compete, and can they? And is there an inherent sort of digital divide happening here as it relates to that, or will the platforms essentially take the learnings from this one and just apply them to the others because they've sort of learned in general this is what this demographic psychographic wants?
I think it will. And I think it's going to be more stark than in the past, maybe when data was less actionable. So
Mm.
if you go to kind of like a pre-AI world, you'd have some businesses that had more data, some businesses that didn't, but it was like more difficult to activate data back then. Now we're in a world where, anyone with, Claude and the ability to sort of connect it to something can do incredibly wild things. Uh, and so I think that does set up this construct, right? Like the way we sort of think about it is like it's not just like having the data, it's actually having like the most rich and robust data. I think of like let's say you had two companies that had like audience data, and one had like just email addresses. That's it. And then another has like email addresses and spending, patterns and like, geography and on and on and on. Like that second, they're both audience data, but the second one's going to be so much more valuable than the first. And I think it's the same with creative data. Like, like it's one thing to know like was there a logo in there, or, like it's another thing to have like effectively like total understanding of creativity in data form. And like I think that like that's sort of like we see our role in the world is to help marketers build and own and operationalize this incredibly important new data asset. And if, like for the last while, we've been doing that in kind of more like a SaaS, construct, like you come to the Vidmob platform and there's all these experiences and, tables and analytics environments, et cetera. Increasingly now we're looking to like actually turn that inside out. And, we're in the process of announcing this sort of Vidmob 360, which is effectively an attempt to open up Vidmob and make it transportable and composable into like any AI system that our clients are building. So, if they're building planning agents or strategy agents or, production agents or whatever it might be, those things, when you give them structured creative data, are just like 1,000x better. Just like a car with gas is 1,000x better than a car without it. And this is where things get really exciting. And I think to your last point, like the platforms are going to offer, some of these elements, but like it gets to like what is the point of marketing, right? Like the point of marketing isn't just to do stuff. The point of marketing is to actually win share and beat other people in your space. And so if Meta rolls out a set of tools to every customer in your space, then it can't logically help any customer in the space because they all do the same thing. Like, and so like there's no gain there. And so that's what we're trying to do is help people get to competitive advantage so that, one marketer can actually beat others by virtue of the fact that they have a richer, more actionable data asset.
So I'd love to learn a little bit more about like if an enterprise brand is using predictive creative scoring, right? Obviously, if you just go off of the scores, you could potentially lead yourself down a path which starts to diverge from your sort of brand truth,
Mhm.
right? So how do you balance that, right? To the extent that you sort of don't let the creative score become the next clickbait.
Yeah.
It's like the ad version of clickbait, where you just get more inflammatory and more, interruptive, but you sort of lost your narrative.
I think it gets to, again, like sort of the complexity and sophistication of the score itself, right?
Right.
And you're 100% right. Like if if your goal is just like action today, then like punch the monkey or whatever like those things are, like that gets you there, right?
Yeah,
Um, but like there's a reason why like LVMH's goal is like 100-year desirability, right? Like and so you need to figure out like what are the metrics that correlate to that like 100-year desirability, to those longer term goals, and then make sure that you have the systems understanding to understand like, all right, well, what are the creative drivers that balance this, these tensions, like, because you do want to drive performance. Everyone's got to hit quarterly targets and drive performance in the now. But we see all sorts of research, whether it's through MMA Global or others, that show that brand is a significant driver of performance, even on a lagging basis. That like brand investments today lead to performance increases 6 and 12 months
for
later.
sure. Yeah, no, we see that all the time.
Yeah. So that ends up being the thing, is like, the scoring systems that we're building are intended to balance those factors. And then you continue to test them, on a go forward basis, and make sure that that correlation to the multi-variable equation continues to hold, and that those scores are actually like accurately predicting the thing you want to drive.
So I want to, take a step back and think about the broader ecosystem, right? So to the extent that better creative is being served to the right person at the right time, that makes for obviously a happier marketer, right? The marketer's like, oh, this is great. I'm getting dramatic performance lift out of finally getting that right message to the right audience at the right time in the right platform. Do you think for the folks who are using that, that gives them a huge advantage because now media that was otherwise not affordable in an auction-based environment suddenly becomes affordable, right? Because they're using this, right? It becomes a leverage point because, in auctions, your ability to bid is directly proportional to the effectiveness of the ad and the ability for you to monetize it on your side as a brand and as a marketer.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, in a sense, it's one of these things that's like incredibly logical, right? Like if you start from the premise that creative is 70% of results, then there's just a whole bunch of things that are downstream of that that like are like completely absurd. Like, like it's absurd that there's no factor for creative quality in an MMM, if you agree that creative is 70%
No,
of results. Like
absolutely.
there's just no way it's accurate if that's the case. I
Yeah.
mean, like it's absurd that bids don't factor in expected creative performance in any way, but they factor in like the weather and the time of day and all these other like tiny like media, like side. So like there's just all these absurdities that I think are kind of like just downstream of the fact that like this wasn't possible in the past.
Sure, for sure. Yeah.
And so like it just takes a little bit for like kind of history to kind of, or things to work itself out. But in that meantime, like now, there's huge opportunity because like the 70% is like completely unoptimized.
Yeah.
And so what we see like again and again and again is when you instrument this and then start making sort of data informed decisions on the creative side, there's like 50, 100, a couple 100% like increases in performance that are sitting there. And then it's exactly what you said, right? Like if you can do that, then you can save tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, and either use that to return that money to shareholders, or spend the same amount and get far more, drive far more profitability as a company.
So, what else should marketers be thinking about as they think about either historical creative assets, like can they reverse analyze the past, or is this really more about, okay, from this point forward, we're going to use creative intelligence systems to understand what's working?
So you can. I mean, like I think ultimately it's like you want to analyze the past, but use it as a guidepost, not like the law. So, when we start working with someone, the first thing we do is, connect, the various accounts they want to have analyzed. And then it pulls a minimum of 13 months of historical data. So, like day one, we're starting from sort of learning about what's happened in the past. And then it continues to ingest and analyze, every impression thereafter. And so, like we're looking to continue to, evolve those learnings, as we go. But yeah, like everyone we work with already has a wealth of available information. They just need to kind of like instrument it and set it up.
So what else should folks be thinking of as they think about sort of the future of creative, and sort of not going down the wrong shiny object rabbit hole, and making sure that they take advantage of what's available now?
I mean, I think it's one of those things that's there's probably obviously a number of large marketers are kind of, well along this path at this point, but it's one of those things that like, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Uh,
Yeah.
it's like if you're not already in this path, like the second best time to start is today. Um, and just start sort of building that. And I think the thing that I would note is that like sometimes people kind of, because the word creative is in there, assume that this is only related to production. And I think that's the wrong takeaway, right? And like that's why sometimes we call instead of like calling it like creative scoring, we'll call it like sales lift score or like media performance score, brand impact score, because this creative data, what we see it impacts the entire marketing workflow, right? So like planning and briefing and strategy and all those like kind of all the way upfront things, 100%, creative data has a big role to play there. Second, all the sort of production systems, as those whether it's human workflows or Gen AI or hybrid, creative data definitely works there, and we've already announced some initial partnerships with Cartel and some other folks. Uh, and then in like media decisioning, like if you can accurately predict pre-flight the performance of every asset in your portfolio, then that has so much relevance on how like dollars are allocated and platform allocation, et cetera. So like like there's huge impact there. And then reporting and I mentioned measurement, like sort of making sure that that creative quality data is being exported out to MMM providers to help make that attribution better. Like this is like a whole workflow impact. And what we see is that people are building AI, systems to help across that whole thing, right? And so, whether it's adopting, Gen AI tools in the production process or, building agents to help with planning or strategy, all of those are going to be better, unequivocally, when given access to richer, better, more current, data, underlying it.
Do you recommend that brands that are a little more adventurous sometimes introduce creative that is quite divergent from the sort of what's winning now? Because obviously you always want to knock the king off the hill for whatever your best performing creative is. But I would imagine that a lot of the creative improvements that get made, right, they you reach a point of diminishing returns. So do you recommend that folks occasionally introduce something dramatically different just to sort of upset the apple cart and give a fresh opportunity to new creative that's quite different?
Absolutely. I mean, like, and like Meta talks about this in terms of like creative diversity.
Right.
And actually we had Jimmy Stone, their head of the creative shop, speak at our annual Creative Data Summit a few weeks ago. And one of the things he talked about was sort of like this idea of like compound branding. That like if corralling and aligning your many thousand pieces of content to tell sort of a unified story. That works really well when those many thousand pieces are actually quite different. I think where people kind of like maybe misconstrued that in the past, and I earlier in my career worked in the game space, was they just thought, all right, well, let's just throw a ton of shit at the algorithm and it'll figure it out, right?
Yeah.
And there still are marketers that are doing that, more generally like D2C and kind of performance type folks. That's not the path I would recommend, right? Like the old like if you give a million monkeys a typewriter, one of them will write the Iliad. Like, yeah, I agree. One of them will, but I wouldn't want to make 999,000 other ones, read the gibberish that came out of them. So like I think that it's about informed, variety. Yeah, and testing like hypotheses, being willing to like kind of broadly break canvas, but this isn't shit throwing, like that's I think hopefully that era is over. Yeah,
Yeah, well, we have AI at our disposal now, so hopefully that will allow us to at least eliminate some of the really bad ideas.
yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks so much, Alex, for sharing your wisdom with myself and viewers and listeners. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's always great chatting, and thanks for bringing me on.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.